Welcome, business leaders, to another installment of the monthly webinar series of the Workforce Resilience Through Mental Fitness campaign. This series is produced by Utah Community Builders, the Salt Lake Chamber's Social Impact Foundation. At these webinars, you'll receive actionable information from experts, innovators, and advocates to help enhance the mental fitness of your employees and make all of Utah's workforce the most resilient in the nation. My name is Davis Smith. I'm the founder and CEO of Cotopaxi. Like everyone here, this topic is one that has touched my life personally, as a dear family member of mine has struggled with mental health. I'm proud to be part of today's webinar. I also have the privilege of serving on the advisory board of Utah Community Builders, and I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. Before we get into today's topic, I want to give special recognition and warm thanks to those who are generously sponsoring this important webinar series. Our major leadership sponsor, the George and Dolores Eccles Foundation, the championship sponsor, AT&T, advocate sponsors, Larry H. Miller Group of Companies, FJ Management, and the Boyer Company, and ally sponsors, Blomquist Hale, Intermountain Healthcare, and the Utah Department of Human Services. My hope is that any of you watching today, whether you're a president or CEO of your company, work in HR or management, or whatever role you play in your organization, will take what you hear today and evaluate your own business and consider how you can make a difference. It's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Carole Mikita. Carole has worked for KSL since 1979 as an anchor and reporter. She will introduce the other speakers today and moderate today's discussion. Carole?
Thank you, Davis. Thank you to the Salt Lake Chamber and all of the sponsors, and for all of you who are here today. It's an honor to be here with you and with Tanya Vea and Lori Prichard. These are two very talented, intelligent, successful women who I admire. It's a difficult subject, but when my friend Heidi Walker here at the Chamber approached me and I spoke with them, there was not hesitation. They feel it's a very important subject that everyone, and a discussion that everyone needs to have. Before I introduce them, please, if you have questions, Nick Dunn will look at them and pass them along to me so that I can ask them of Lori or Tanya. Tanya Vea is Senior Vice President and General Manager of Bonneville International Corporation, our fearless leader. And Lori is our lead morning anchor and Emmy Award-winning journalist. Each of these women experienced something neither one of them would have imagined in August of 2019. And I will turn the time over first to Lori and then Tanya to tell the story of how what happened affected first and most importantly our beloved colleague, and then how our company responded. Lori?
Thanks, Carole. So in August of 2019, my husband died by suicide, and I am a Utah transplant. We both were. We're both from Missouri originally, and I found myself 1,200 miles away from my family and in a crisis. And the first person I had to call, this was in between our morning and noon shows when I came home to find out that this had happened. And I had to call KSL to tell someone that I wasn't coming back for our noon show. And the person I called was my boss, Leona Wood. And I don't remember at all what I said to her, but she said, "I'm coming to you." And she did. She was the first person at my side when I learned that my husband had killed himself. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for that in so many ways, because I've had conversations since then about about that day and what transpired. And, she almost was an objective presence for me, where she was able to, she didn't know my husband. She may have met him once, but she was able to do things like talk to the police on my behalf, and without being the emotional wreck that I was. She was able to talk to Tanya, who then was able to get me in contact with the woman who later became my therapist. Because at that moment, I didn't know my children were at school, and I didn't know what to tell them about their father. I had no idea. This was a complete surprise to me. And I knew it would be just a complete surprise to them. They had just seen him that morning as I got them ready for school. And I had no idea what to say. And Tanya was instrumental in getting me help, so that I knew I had the tools to tell them in a way that my first reaction is I wanted to lie to them. I wanted to just tell them that he had a heart attack or had hit his head or something. I just had no idea what to do. And I'm so glad that I was able to talk to someone in the mental health profession who said, no, you cannot lie to them. You have to tell them the truth. So that started a cascade of decisions for me that I think in the end was healthier for my family than what maybe I would have done initially had I not had that help. But then it kept going. I was telling one of my dear friends at work, Shara Park, the first 4 people I saw after I learned that my husband died were all from KSL. Whether it was Shara, who showed up at my door, or Tanya's assistant, who showed up with food and just kept bringing it inside. And then there was the business of getting my family to Utah, and KSL was instrumental in that. They're the ones that took over. They're the ones that made the arrangements. I had family members staying at hotels. I can't even tell you which hotel. I have no idea. KSL took care of that. So in the short term, they insulated me from some of the difficult decisions I had to make, on top of the already difficult decisions I had to make. But even in the long term, and we can talk about that too as we move along through this hour, but in the long term, they gave me room to breathe and to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And knowing that I'm now the sole provider for my children. And Tanya, again, was instrumental in that. She really was. And I'm so grateful, not only to the company itself, but the people who make up that company. I mean, I'm sitting here today healthier than I think I could have been because of those people and what they did for me and my family.
Tanya, do you want to pick it up?
Yeah, let me just first say how difficult this is, just to walk through. And as Lori's telling that story, I'm reliving those moments, and I'm sure that you are too. And so thank you, Lori, for being willing to do this and have this conversation, because I know you and I both feel how critically important this is from a business perspective for people to have an understanding. And there really isn't business training that prepares you for a day like Lori just described. There's not life training that prepares you for a day like Lori just described. So the reason we were able to help her and be able to step in is because I had life training in a similar way, in a very different circumstance, but in very similar ways. And so I knew people to put her in contact with, and I knew some of what she would be facing. But I would strongly recommend that you don't need life training for that you can prepare yourself better from a business standpoint, from a management standpoint, to know what to do and to know how to help in those moments when you're getting a call from a very valued employee and a person on the other end of that phone who's in crisis and who needs help in that moment. so that you do understand the ways to help. And what we did for Lori would be different than what we would maybe do and what we have done in other circumstances from a business standpoint, just based on the circumstances. Lori's family, as she just said, wasn't here. She did not have that immediate support system around her. And so we knew that would be important to step in and help in some of those ways, and tried to do that. There would be other circumstances where time and space and being able to just step back and back away and let family come in and do those things and support in different ways may be more valuable. So it really isn't a one-size-fits-all circumstance in a crisis situation. You have to evaluate in the moment what's needed of that moment. And that's what we tried to do. But we're starting to build some of those things that we know now into our business practices.
And I would ask each one of you to talk about from the immediate shock of what happened and taking care of Lori's needs and seeing to what was happening along those lines, to when it became a little more long-term. There really wasn't any way to know, Lori, for you, this dealing with grief and how long that takes, and your children and everything that involved. And Tanya, what the company had in its realm before this happened, and what changed perhaps with Lori's situation that made you look a little more long-term about what the company could change or needed to do. So Lori, when you talk a bit about grief and how long a period that might be for someone.
I think immediately after Travis died, I wanted to know, well, when am I going back to work? Which is a ridiculous thing to think about. But I wanted to know, and it's funny because I would call Tanya and she literally would say, don't worry, you don't have to worry. But it was something that kept, I needed answers. And I was so attached because Leona, my boss, who I hadn't necessarily been close with prior to, it's not like she really knew anything personally about my life. I was so attached to her that because of that day and what had transpired, I wanted to talk above her, because I didn't think at that time I could have an objective conversation with her. And I knew that I could with Tanya. And so I kept, I'd call Tanya and we would talk and she'd say, don't worry. And then finally she said, okay, let's meet and we can decide, like we'll talk about the next steps and give you some things to think about. Because I was trying to put together what my life may look like in the future, but I knew I was in I had no emotional capability to go back to work yet. But I knew eventually that's something that I wanted to do. I just didn't know when. And so Tanya was generous enough to spend, and we would spend a couple hours sitting in a coffee shop in Salt Lake, and not even necessarily talking directly about work, but about life as well. And it just was comforting to me to know I'm going to be okay. My job's going to be okay. Let me figure out my personal life so then I can figure out my professional life. And I will tell you, fast forward today, it's been a year and a half since Travis passed away. And as much as I adore my boss, Leona, and have such warm feelings about her, I look at her very much now like she's my boss. Like I feel like that employee manager relationship remains intact. In the beginning, I'm not sure that I felt that way, but now as I've healed, I feel like those normal established relationships are also back to normal.
And Tanya, from your perspective, you knew by talking with Lori, counseling with Lori, this was going to take some time, and this was something new for the company.
Exactly, and especially in Lori's role, because it's a high-profile, public-facing role. So that's a very different thing than even from if you had a manager go out, or somebody other in high-intensity role within the organization. But Lori's role was very public, so we had to do two things. How long did Lori need? And I knew immediately that we were going to give her the space that she needed, and we would figure that out as we went. I'm fortunate that that's how I felt, but I was also supported in that all the way up the chain. We have a compassionate owner, and that trickles down. But we're compassionate as a business, not because we are not a church. We run a business, and that's a very different thing. And so what we needed to do was figure out, how do we communicate that internally? How do we communicate this externally? How do we protect Lori's privacy to the extent that she needed or wanted that? So that ball was in her court, not in our court, but we had to message something. You can't take your main morning anchor off the air for potentially a month or more, which it ended up being more, without communicating something to the audience and them not feeling like she's just disappeared, which we did not want. So it's, how do you protect the organization? How do you protect the show? How do you protect Lori? How do you communicate that to the audience? There were a lot of moving pieces in that, but I started from, how do we protect Lori? And we'll move it all out from there. What does she need? What do we need to do from an employee standpoint? That's our first and foremost, that was front and center. And then every other detail, we'll just figure it out from there based on what she's comfortable with, and it will be a conversation, which it was all along the way. Lori was really adamant about, as she just said, about wanting to get that date back. And I understand that when your life feels like it's just blown up, you need some semblance of control. And so some idea of being able to say, I can put a marker on this. What we did is we started putting target dates. So it was, let's say we'll talk again on this date, and we'll set this as the first target date for, you'll come back, and then we'll set a date in advance of that to discuss how you're doing. Are you ready? What do you need? And I think we did that probably three different times, maybe more, where we moved that target date down to and including on the last day, the day before she was supposed to come back. We had it set, we had talked, and I was in a conversation with a consultant that we had who said, but is she ready? And I said, well, she said she's ready. He said, but is she ready? And I thought, I'm going to go pick up the phone and call her right now and have that conversation, because that date was set. And you weren't ready to come back. It was but you felt like we had moved that day. You needed to be ready. So it was in a last minute conversation between the two of us where we just decided, no, that's fine. We'll move that date back again. And that's not a problem. So we did that at the last minute.
Tanya, could I interrupt you quickly? Because I need to give you decided that. This is the thing about KSL that I want people to understand. She was protecting me in a way that, I mean, and we're not talking, okay, I'll give you another week. It was another 2 months. 2 months. She said, you know what? I'm making the decision. I don't think you're ready. We're going to give you, let's go until, so I was supposed to come back sometime in November. And she said, I'm going to give you until January. So you made that decision on my behalf because you were protecting me. And so I want people to know and understand that, because again, I'm so grateful for the people who gave me the opportunity to heal, because I'm not sure that I would have ever come back. So anyway, continue, but I just wanted to give you the credit that you deserve, Tanya.
Well, I think that's an important point, though, what Lori just said is, so if you're looking at this from a human standpoint, of course, we did all the things that we did. And if you're looking at this from a business standpoint, I don't want to lose Lori as an employee. In the long run, I want Lori on the air. I want her on the morning show, and I want her to be able to come back into that space successfully. And so how do we manage that? And I think that's what you have to look at from a business perspective is the value is the employee, and how do I help protect and protect their value. So I don't want her to leave the organization and have to feel like she's got to go somewhere else because she can't get that space. And in the scheme of things, over the course of the number of years that Lori's been with the organization, 2 months or 4 months is not that much time. It feels like an enormous amount of time when you're given 3 to 5 days for bereavement, which is a joke. And that's a ridiculous amount of time from a grief perspective. We can talk, that could be a whole nother session. But especially when you're dealing with traumatic loss, it just is not adequate. And so what we did was, again, like I said, Lori was our first and foremost consideration. It was really all about what does she need, what does her family need, and then how do we protect the business from there. But it was good for our business to make that decision.
And you touched on something, Tanya, that I think is important for all of our CEOs to understand, because what is on the books is not necessarily what works, and sometimes you learn that. So did you basically, with upper management, those even above you, rewrite things to decide to make it, to tailor make it for each employee's situation going forward?
So we are, and this is where a lot of organizations, and us included, you're really held to policies that are in place, and you sometimes want to do things that you can't do, and that becomes a little bit more complex. So, and I won't get into any of the details beyond just saying Lori's a contract employee, and that allowed us some freedom and some flexibility to do things around those policies that that made a lot of these decisions a little bit easier than it would have been for a non-contract employee. So, so that's, and I don't want to get into any of the details beyond that, but there was a distinction in that. And then we started working internally about how do we, as we're making these decisions, how are we equitable about this? So, not all death is the same, not all grief is the same, not all crisis is the same. And so not every employee needs, in fact, most employees don't need the level of care and concern that we needed to put around this. But Lori is not the only, this is not the only instance that we have had in the organization. When I suffered a similar but loss, I was given different kinds of consideration. We had another employee 2 months after Lori who lost her daughter very suddenly. And we went through exactly the same exercise, but just did different things based on her needs. So none of that was in policy. And that's what you're trying to get to, Carole. It's and most of it still isn't. Those are slower changes. So those are things that we've opened conversations. HR is very proactive about that. We're thinking about that in a hands-on way about how can we modify those policies in the best possible way so that it's equitable in these situations, so that it doesn't matter who's sitting in the chairs, that's just the way organizationally we handle this. Not all of it, though, has been done. We have not made changes across the board yet.
Thank you. And I have a couple of questions, and this one for Lori. As a local celebrity, how has support from viewers or social media followers helped you?
That's something else that I think is so interesting, because the amount of support that I get from people, not only in Utah, but around the globe. I mean, I've gotten messages from people in Ireland, in Australia, in Canada, but I'll speak specifically to the people here in Utah. I may post something about how I'm doing or how I'm feeling, and truly the love and the support that I get from people here, people that I haven't met. And I was telling my mother this. I'm like, maybe post-COVID, we could have an open house at KSL, and I can invite these people who consistently post on my Facebook page, telling me you know, that they support me, or they support my family, or they're cheering for me, or they hope I'm doing better. I have not seen one negative post, not one in the year and a half since my husband died. Truly, not one. Because of just the groundswell of support that I feel like I've gotten from the people in Utah.
Thank you. And I've read some of those, and indeed I've been touched by them too. Another question, and I think maybe this is for Tanya. How did KSL's culture or our need to constantly adjust based on our live TV model help this situation? What can other companies learn from that model during a time of crisis? So I guess we're talking about, we're always ready to change or be on or address something. Did that enter into it?
Yeah, I think instinctively, now, obviously in the last year with COVID, we've all been forced to change in ways that were beyond what we had prepared for. So I think a lot of businesses are better prepared to deal with a crisis situation than they would have been a year ago. But it's a different thing when you're dealing with a crisis of business versus a crisis of staff, a crisis of an employee and a person. And that's what, it's compassion. And I've talked about this before, but I see compassion as a business practice and something that gives you a competitive difference and a competitive edge. It's not about being, it's being human. And I mentioned this earlier, obviously our organization is geared to do these kinds of things, to put its arms around employees, to think about their family needs, to think about their personal well-being, to think about those kinds of things. That's an important part of our particular business and our particular organization. I would argue it should be an important part of business, not just Bonneville's business. Because it is a competitive differentiator. You have people who will want to work for you because of those kinds of things. You'll attract better talent. You'll keep better talent like Lori, or in the case of the other employee that I talked about, she said the same thing. She would have quit had we said, you've got 2 weeks and then you need to be back to work. She wouldn't have been able to do it and she would have quit. And she's a very, very high value employee like Lori. So potentially within the span of 6 months, we could have lost 2 very critical employees to our team because of losses that were out of their control in their personal lives that they had to go and deal with. There is no option in that. It's not optional for when that kind of shock and grief hits your life. You can't set it aside. You shouldn't set it aside. So at that point, work needs to be set aside, just like it would if there were an illness or something else. So we make allowances for that. We have leave policies for that, short-term and long-term leave for that. We need to treat grief in similar ways.
I'd like to address colleagues. I'll phrase it well-meaning colleagues, and I include myself in this. And I think even if you wish to be of help, sometimes it's timing is everything. I remember, and I think it was probably early December, going to Leona and saying that I wanted to do something. I wanted to do something for Lori, and maybe you both can address this. And she said to me very wisely, that's a lovely idea, but this is not the time. And colleagues also need to understand grief. And maybe you can both explain what I mean by that.
Well, you know, I think I was so grateful. I know people say thoughts and prayers, you know, thoughts and prayers, that doesn't really mean anything or do anything. I was willing to take any thought or prayer anyone wanted to bestow me or send my direction. And so, I mean, I had people, colleagues that I work with that would text me every now and again, how are you? You don't have to respond, I'm thinking of you. Or I had some who would send me dinner, or just different, that went on for the duration of a year. It was a year later and I still had people showing up from KSL with dinner. And I mean, I think knowing that you're being thought of by the people that you work with, whether you work closely with them or not, but knowing how supported you are. I was telling one of Shara, who is with me on the morning show, I was telling her this morning, I said, I genuinely love the people that I work with. Genuinely love them. They are my family because they have shown themselves to be my family. And so when Tanya talks about keeping those employees that you might otherwise lose, I owe KSL, and Tanya has said this to me so many times, and I'll preface this by saying, she has said, you don't owe us anything. I owe KSL and the people in it my mental health because they gave me so much support in a time that I desperately needed it. And so, yes, I will do everything that I can to support KSL and the people in it. Tanya would have to push me out because I'm not leaving. So I'm so grateful.
We don't want you to leave, so that's a good thing. And the point in that with Lori was we needed. Lori may have needed to make different decisions for her life that KSL may or may not have been a part of. And what we were trying to prioritize in that moment was you're not beholden to us in that way. If your life has changed and if you need to make a different life decision, then we support that equally to what we're supporting now, and we would understand that. So it's allowing for that space. And that's from a business standpoint, I want to tell you, that's a really hard place to be because that was not in our best interest to say, if you need to leave, we will accommodate that. In our best interest was we want you to stay and we want you to be here and we want you to come back and be healthy and strong and be on the air and be good. So that's what we wanted. But that's not really up to us. You need to let people make the decisions that they need to make. So from a business standpoint, but I would say, Carole, to your point about the help, and thank you for raising this because I didn't think about this until you did. So much of our staff stepped up internally too, as Lori was saying, reached out, but also stepped up internally to say, we'll fill in, we'll fill in for as long as needed, we'll cover shifts, we'll do, and just never complained and offered and did it. And so internally, we had this culture where people surrounded her with love and care and concern, but internally they stepped up and did extra work and did it willingly and volunteered to do it. And so that made this whole process, a much easier thing from a management standpoint.
I have another question, and I think this is perhaps both of you, but first to Tanya. We're talking about steps that you can take now that other businesses, so that they can be prepared to support employees. Do you have some advice for what someone can do now before anything happens?
Yes. If you have not experienced traumatic loss in some way, suicide loss or some other traumatic loss, first of all, feel very, very grateful, but educate yourself and educate yourself on mental health issues so that you have a good understanding from a management standpoint, from a CEO level, from a leader of your organization. Take some time and educate yourself in the same way you would on a business practice, some learning about what does all of that entail? Because I promise you, at some point in your career, you're going to deal with a crisis of this, where it's a sudden loss or it's a sudden illness from somebody in your ranks. And most of you at this level probably already have. But you're much better off if you know if you have at least some sort of toolkit in how to do that. And we take training on so many other things in business, but why don't we take training on how to deal with these kinds of crises that come up with employees and with staff and just in life? They happen in life. So I would say first and foremost, educate yourself and then start putting some things in place. Work with your HR department, work within your leadership team about how how should we handle something like this? How would we want to? What's the culture? How do you start thinking about that from a culture standpoint? And then look at your policies. And that's the hardest part. Frankly, that's the very hardest part, because there's some things you'll be able to change and some things you just won't. But if you have a better understanding, if you're better educated about it, you'll be better able to respond in those moments.
I have another question, and this is for Lori. What tools helped you move forward with not just work, but your family and your personal life that you can share with us? Because there may be others in a similar space.
I think number one was the woman who became my therapist. Her name's Dr. Ann Hutton, and Tanya was the one that introduced me to her. Her specialty is in grief and suicide. And I think seeing her over the course of a year helped me put suicide and a depressed brain into context so I could understand it from a medical standpoint, from a diseased brain, looking at it that way and how it thinks and behaves. And so I was grateful not to have to search for someone. She was there. She was literally handed to me on a platter. And I was very grateful for that, because I know it does take time to find a good therapist that you can connect with. And that was immediate for us. In fact, she saw us the day of my, not only me, but later my boss, Leona, came and picked me and my children up and took us to the University of Utah to see her. And we were able to sit with her for an hour, which I think was, my son was 10 and my daughter was 13. And I think it was helpful for them to understand depression and suicide from the lens of a disease. And she was able to put that in context for them. So that was helpful. And the second thing is just time. Just time. Every day, I'm better today than I was yesterday, and I'll be better tomorrow than I was today.
Lori, you have been very honest, both among your colleagues and on social media, that this is a life-changing experience, and some days are good and some days are bad, but that's okay, because you're moving forward, but you're learning still. There's not an end to this kind of grief. You're going to go forward learning for the rest of your life. That's also something that I heard a friend who experienced a loss, that friends expected her to go back to the person that she was before. I think maybe your messages are assuring everyone that this is a lifelong process.
It is. Yeah. I look at the picture that I took that morning of me on the set the day that he died, and I'll never be that person again. But we'll be okay. We'll be okay. We're healing.
And Tanya, from a management standpoint, not only Lori, but others, we have to change our thinking about what grief does to our colleagues, correct?
Oh yeah, without any question. It's, I don't understand why, if you have a baby and you get months of maternity leave. I just signed a maternity leave for an employee this morning, and it will be several months. And having a baby is a life-changing event. And as is this is an equal life-changing event in a very different way. And so I don't, organizationally, why we don't see those things similarly and treat them the same way and allow that kind of same space to adjust from a life standpoint, where we see too often in society, grief as a a weakness and just a need to, as Lori said, come back to being the same person, and in those cases, you just don't, your life is forever changed. Lori's using her story to help other people, which is a really wonderful thing. And she has the platform to do it within the organization. So that's something that we strongly, strongly support, is changing conversations around mental health or mental fitness, however you want to phrase it. It's equally important as physical health. And we should treat it no differently. There just shouldn't be any different stigma around having a mental health crisis or a broken leg or a heart attack or cancer. It's just all an illness that's happening. It's a disease that's happening within your mind. And so we need to see it more that way from a societal standpoint and definitely from a business standpoint. But grief in its purest form is love, right? And it's a strength. It's not a weakness. And so understanding that and being able to allow employees to feel that and be open about that is, I just don't see that as a problem, as part of life.
Lori, as Tanya mentioned, you have a platform and you have used it. That took a certain amount of courage for you to speak so personally from your heart and from your grief. Have you received messages back that people needed to hear what you had to say?
I'm doing research right now on people who have been suicidal or who are currently experiencing depression, because I want to understand how, as a family member, you can help. There was so much that I see now that I didn't realize before. And I eventually, when I'm done, and when I say I'm doing research, I just interviewed a gentleman here in Utah, and tomorrow I'm interviewing a woman in Sydney, Australia. And next week I'm interviewing a gentleman in Montreal, Canada. This isn't just a Utah problem. It's not a problem that Americans face. I mean, mental health is a global issue. And I want to be able to offer people like me. I'm not an expert. I don't have any medical training, but I want to be able to offer families some tools so that they can support those in their family who are experiencing depression or struggling. And I just spoke to a woman not too long ago. Her 15-year-old son, 15, killed himself, and she has no idea why. None. And so why is this happening? And what can we do as family members to support those who are struggling? And that's how I want to use my platform, is to help, to offer that help.
Thank you. I would love for you both to, as you look back from where you are now, talk about what you have learned that you would like to share with everyone gathered today that they can take with them. It has been an emotionally very trying time, but I'm very grateful that each one of you would speak as honestly as you have. What would you like everyone to take away from this that you have learned that may be of value to them?
Do you want to start, Lori? Lori mentioned meeting in the coffee shop, and it was one of those coffee shop conversations where she and I were talking about exactly what we're talking about here today in this session, about the need for this to become more a part of business, as opposed to we're just doing it because we're doing it in this instance. And so I've taken that on so it was in a conversation with Lori that I really started about, okay, how can I try to affect change within the organization? How can I work on this? How can I bring this up? How can I take this forward? Which is why I was so willing to do this session. I think it's really, really important for businesses beyond ours to be thinking about these issues long term. So I learned that. I took that away. I learned that as a leader, you'll deal with things that you go to work in the morning, and just like things happen in your life, things happen. This came completely unexpected for all of us in that day and in that moment. And so, how can you be prepared in an instant to be able to do what you need to do from a leadership standpoint and from a compassionate standpoint? And then I'm just going to add one plug in here because Lori mentioned Ann Hutton. She's at the University of Utah, and she's it's called Caring Connections. And since we have a group of business leaders, I would strongly encourage you. It's a small group at the nursing school, and I don't know if they take donations, but if they do, you should be looking at them to donate to, because this organization, they are lifesavers in these moments, and they have helped. Lori has talked about that openly. They have helped me. They have helped several people in our staff, and have just done so at the drop of a hat. So Caring Connections at the University of Utah, I would look to them if you're looking to make a donation.
Thank you. It's important to know where to go because Lori, you said that first introduction to her was actually life-changing. And it was no coincidence that Tanya knew who to send your way.
Well, and I think about it, as I mentioned, just thinking about the damage I could have done by lying to my children. That day, I was just literally trying to get from moment to moment to moment to moment. And so what was I going to tell them so that we could go to the next moment? And lying seemed to be the easiest thing to do. I can't imagine the damage I could have done to them had I lied. And so being able to talk to Anne about what I should say and how I should say it, she told me exactly what to say to them. And I said it word for word. And so I have told Leona, my boss, looking back on that day, and as awful and as horrible as it was, the way it unfolded and the help that I received, I think we as a family got through it maybe in a healthier way than we could have otherwise, because of the support that I received, particularly from the people at KSL, truly. And not only that, but my mother said, she said, I expected that you, meaning me, would get support from my company, but she didn't expect to get support from them as well. And I'm talking my extended family was supported by KSL. I think that's remarkable.
Well, it speaks to what Tanya said. We, from the top down, and we are talking about Keith McMullen, the insistence is that we be a compassionate company, not because we are owned by a church, but because this is a business that needs to start from that point and go forward. So maybe that is, one of the things. You can think you are there until you really have a crisis moment, and then you learn what you need to do to fill in the blanks, or what you need to change in your company to become truly compassionate. And I think, Tanya, you led the way there, but it happened very quickly and suddenly. And there was a realization that, okay, we say we are, but what do we need to do to get there?
You mentioned Keith McMullen, and I'll just tell you, he may be the most compassionate, kind person I've ever met in my life. And so I would say that's modeled behavior from the top down. in a way that we could only hope to be the kind of person that he is. But I won't get too much more into Keith because I would not stop. I think very highly of him. So.
If there, we need to probably close this out unless there are other questions coming. Is there anything else that you have learned that may be valuable to everyone who's gathered here today? Learning, even as we speak, continuing to learn as this situation grows and there are others. And Lori, as you learn more about dealing with grief and your children, and as they grow up and their lives go forward, is there anything else, Tanya or Lori, that you would like to share that might be valuable to our audience today?
I just think, looking at this from a business perspective, the way KSL treated me, I am now, I mean, I hope I always was a dedicated employee, but I'm really a dedicated employee. My boss can call me and say, hey, will you do this for me? And I will, with joy, I will do anything for you with a smile on my face, and I'm happy to do it. And I think if you want people who give everything that they have to your company, this is how you treat them, because I'm evidence of that.
Yeah, I just echo what Lori said, and I've used this phrase several times, but it's one I believe in, and that's compassion as a business practice or a business principle. I would take to heart what Lori just said.
Thank you both. It's an emotional subject, but one that we all need to become much more familiar with and much more sensitive to as we go through life. I am grateful. As I said, I have the greatest respect for these two women, and there was no hesitation, as we knew we were gathering today, on either part to share this story with all of you. So we thank you for all being with us. We hope it's been valuable to you. And we hope going forward that you know that we're here if you have further questions. So once again, thank you to all of the sponsors, and particularly to the Salt Lake Chamber for hosting us. We are most grateful. Tanya and Lori, my gratitude to both of you.
Thank you, Carole.